46a. Actually, we're up to 46b, but I want to go over a little on 46a. So on Mem Vav, going to do a little on Mem Vav Amud Aleph, 46a. We've been discussing this Gemara that has numerous interpretations of the commentaries. Ad Heichan Berchas Hazimun, which is halfway down the page, and it talks about the Zimun, which is by the grace after meal. The beginning part of the grace after meal, beginning part of the Berchas Hamazon is called the Zimun, and we've been discussing. According to Rashi, the question was ad heichan, until where is this Berchas Hazimun? It meant where does it reach that if a person doesn't have a Zimun, where would they start from? And according to Rashi, it came out that you might even be able to skip the first bracha of the benching in order to because the first bracha is really part of Zimun, and therefore you really would only have to start maybe from the second bracha. Now, there's two opinions, of course. We have Rav Sheshis and Rav Nachman, these two opinions of the Gemara. One opinion is that the Zimun ends after that sentence of let us say grace together and so on. Right after there, according to Rav Nachman. But according to Rav Sheshis, really Zimun continues until after the first bracha, and that was the way Rashi learned it, and that's how you have that machlokes. And Tosfos had a different interpretation, and the way Tosfos learned was we're dealing with someone who is stopping their meal in order to answer Zimun, and then they are going to continue eating. And the question was, how long do they have to stop and interrupt their meal in order to participate in this Zimun? And so they stop their meal either until the end of the sentence Baruch Shachan Mishaloi, and or they stop their eating until after the first bracha. And the logic for that, Tosfos told us, had to do with the fact that there isn't really Hashem's name in the Zimun, and so it's not a real bracha. So if they're really participating, they need to participate in something that's considered a real bracha, full bracha, and therefore the first bracha of the benching, that sort of is considered the bracha that completes the Zimun, that makes the Zimun the real thing, or a full-fledged Zimun, and therefore you would have to stop eating until after the first bracha of the benching. And so that's the way Tosfos learned. And then of course they had the two brises. There were two statements in the brises which we tried to fit. Initially, the Gemara thought it's the same argument of Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshis over here, and then the Gemara came up and explained the different interpretations. Again, and they're also, in those brises, we also had two ways of learning. Rashi's way had to do with the question of how many brachas are there biblically in the Berchas Hazimun, and the way Tosfos learned was if you have different people that remember only how to say one of the brachas of the Zimun, how do you divide that up? In other words, you cannot divide up one bracha in two people. So in other words, if I know the Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, and someone else knows the end, you can't do that and say, oh, we had each other in mind. I had you in mind, you had me in mind. No, every bracha is an entity of its own. And therefore, if you have different people that know each bracha, one person knows one bracha, one person knows the second bracha, then you could divide up the benching according to that order. And of course, the less people to divide it up, the better, the Gemara says. And that's why the Gemara gives either 3 or 2 or 4 or 3, emphasizing that the least is better. But if you don't, you could do the bigger number. And so that was the way Tosfos learned, and it had to do with the fact that what is considered a complete bracha or not. In other words, do we consider the Zimun an entity of its own, and then comes the first bracha of the benching, or do we combine the two and consider the two into one bracha? And based on that, the Gemara thought that it's connected to the previous argument of Rav Nachman, Rav Sheshis. The Gemara answered that no, it's not exactly connected. Okay, you see we have some questions over here. David?
Yeah, according to the reasoning that the zimun doesn't have Hashem's name, therefore it's not really a bracha. What about a 10-person zimun that does have Hashem's name?
Oh, that's a very good question. And it is brought down that there is a statement in Shulchan Aruch, and I don't know if it's the final word, but there's definitely an opinion that says when you have a 10 people zimun, you actually don't need to wait until the end of the first bracha because it has Hashem's name. But I think there is a debate. It's only Elokeinu. You don't have Elokeinu Melech HaOlam. So I don't know that you can rely on that. But your point is a valid point, and I believe it is mentioned there. Maybe in the Torah, there is definitely a mention of that idea that there could be a difference between a 3-person benching and a 10-person benching because you do have Hashem's name based on this Tosfos over here on page 46a. Yes, good point. Good point. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to know is Rashi and Tosfos is a bunch of people, I think, not just one person, right?
Well, Rashi is one person.
Is Rashi not part of Tosfos?
Rashi is the grandfather, and he had a lot of grandchildren that he taught even, and yet they added a lot. Tosfos just means they added, and they added onto the interpretations and onto the insights into the Gemara. And,
so they are the latest.
But there's numerous rabbis that were all considered part of the Baalei HaTosfos, the rabbis of the Tosfos. That one Tosfos might be a rabbi called Rabbeinu Tam, another one would be the Ri. There's numerous rabbis that are the Rashbam. There are numerous rabbis that are that make up the Tosfos, and they don't always. It doesn't always say the name of which one it is.
But they all agree with each other.
I can't hear. They don't what?
They all agree with each other.
They all agree? That's not necessarily so, no.
Not with Rashi, but they all agree with each other from Tosfos, no?
No.
Oh.
No, the Tosfos over here, who says it might not fit with the Tosfos somewhere else? It's different Baalei Tosfos.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And then there is more like the Shulchan Aruch or whatever, that might have different ideas. Right?
I'm not hearing every word you're saying. I'm not sure if it's my volume or your microphone.
There is more people that are involved in your explanations than Rashi and Tosfos. Are they all from the same period, or are they all the latest?
So no, there's definitely a large period of time that the Baalei Tosfos lived, but they started with the grandchildren of Rashi.
I see. Okay.
And Rashi lived in Rashi is one person, Shlomo Yitzchok.
Right.
So he's one person, he's one period of time. Okay, so was there any other questions? I'm not sure if I saw someone else's hand. I guess not. Okay, so the thing is that the Gemara mentioned about the Payalim. The Payalim, they are able actually to summarize the benching. And the next Gemara mentions them because the next Gemara talks about how do we know that Berachas HaToiva Meitiv is rabbinic? Again, there was an opinion that we mentioned that it's biblical, but then the Gemara says, I'm going to prove you, Teda, I will prove to you, and this is 4 lines from the bottom, it proves to you that the Gemara says, well, I'll prove to you that it is not D'Oraisa, it's not biblical, it's rabbinic. And this is a statement from Rabbi Yitzchok bar Shmuel bar Marta in the name of Rav. And what is the proof? Well, actually, let me start from the one before. The one before is I'm going to prove to you, this is Amar Rav Yosef. I'm going to prove to you that it's Lav D'Oraisa, Toiva Meitiv. The final brach of the benching is not biblical. What's the proof? Because Payalim Oikrenaisa. Because the Payalim, the workers, they uproot this bracha. And what does that mean? Because the workers don't have to say the final bracha of the benching, even though it's the rabbis established it. But they said there's bittul malacha. It's going to cause a issue for the balabayas that the workers are not going to do work, and because of that, we allow the rabbis allowed them not to recite the final bracha of the benching. Why would they do that? Obviously, it is rabbinic. And we discussed it a little yesterday, But I want to go a drop deeper because I mentioned the previous Gemara. Now, I mentioned a Gemara earlier in the Masechta, page 16. The Gemara earlier on page 16 mentioned this law that about workers. Now, what are the two laws that we know about the workers regarding benching? So there's two things we know. One thing is that they don't have to say the final bracha. And what's the second thing that we learned? Also, we currently learned on this page of Gemara, we learned another law about workers, that they can summarize the other three brachas into two. Right? The first bracha, they say in its completion, they complete it.
Yeah.
The second and third bracha, they summarize into one. So if you have the first bracha and the second and third summarized into one, so you have 1 + 1 is 2, so you have two brachas, and they don't say the fourth bracha, which means that they're only saying two brachas. So they're summarizing the first two. I'm sorry, they're summarizing the second and third, and they're into one, and they're reciting the first bracha. So altogether you have two brachas. Now, yes, Ezra.
I think isn't the reason why they are allowed to do that is because we're talking about poalim that are actually working in trees, and you want them to have the proper kavanah in their work as well as whatever that's being said. So therefore, you want them to be able to finish whatever they're doing because they're normally stopped wherever they are in order to eat and then continue on. And so you're allowing this to happen so that they don't, because they're in a precarious position, let's put it that way.
Right, so you're thinking that they're up in the tree and they might fall. And you want them to have as little time concentrating on benching, more concentrating on that they don't fall.
No, I want them to concentrate on benching without putting themselves at risk.
Danger. So the Gemara, you are correct in a sense that the Gemara there does deal with that as well. Do we make them go down? Do we make them stay up? But here we're not dealing with them in the tree. Here we're simply dealing
Doesn't it have to do with their time they're being paid by the time, so they're stealing from their master if they take his time to do their benching.
Yeah, except for the fact that it wouldn't exactly be stealing. If they were obligated to bench, then that would be part of the package. But the rabbis sort of felt bad for the worker who needs this work done, and it's bittul malacha. So therefore, they exempted them from this. Again, so it wouldn't be exactly stealing, because if they were obligated to do it, then it would be okay. So I don't, I don't know if we can use the word stealing, but it's the Chachamim felt that this is a bittul malacha. It's causing, if you want the exact wording, Tosfos on page 16 actually used a certain wording over there that he says on page 16. He says, "Utrudim b'malachas balabayas." They're busy with the work of the balabayas, and we don't obligate them to say the fourth bracha. So again, so my point is that Tosfos doesn't say the word they would be stealing. He uses an explanation of why the Chacham did this. Now, what's interesting is why do they not have to say the fourth bracha? What's the reason? What is the exemption? It's rabbinic, right? The rabbis have the right to. It's not why the rabbis did it, but what allows them to not do the fourth bracha? The rabbis, they made that bracha, they exempted them. But the other question is, what about the first three brachas? What are they doing with those first three brachas? They're not saying them fully. They're skipping a lot. They're saying the first one, and then the second and third, they're making a summary of it. Now, what about that? That's biblical. You want to tell me the fourth bracha? That's rabbinic, okay. Fine, they could. The rabbi said goodbye, no problem. What about the first three? You could just switch around. This is biblical. They have to say these three brachas. So on this, if you look back on page 16, Taisus over there is bothered with this question. And Taisus over there says that the Chachamim have the koyach to be oiker dover min haTorah. The rabbis have the ability to uproot something from the Torah. So they could uproot laws in the Torah. And I mentioned this yesterday as a method of, in a passive way. So something that in a passive way, they could uproot a law in the Torah. And what is that law that they're uprooting? So the case that Taisus is referring to is the first three brachas of the benching. They're actually uprooting because they're switching, they're allowing you to get away with skipping a lot of words and summarizing it into instead of three brachas into two brachas. Susan, do you have a question? Because I see your hands up.
Yes, you said a word before that I didn't understand. Pitololim, what is that?
Poalim.
Poalim are the workers.
Poalim are workers.
Okay, thank you.
But Rabbi,
Yeah.
The reason why they allow it, I mean, the Torah basically says that you have uberachta, and you have to bless. Okay, but what is the blessing itself? That is required. This is what the rabbis are responsible for. And so if you're going to say that they are allowed to be okay, they're not okay on the berachta. What they are okay on is the form that they have defined as being what you need to do to satisfy that requirement.
Okay, that's great. Ezra just said a beautiful insight. That is that it's not. It doesn't. It's a little surprising what Tosfos says, because Tosfos says that what do you do? How did the rabbis have the ability to uproot the three brachas that are biblical? How could they do that? Tosfos says, you can't just because they're workers, you can't just uproot something on the. No, you're allowed to. There is if it's passive, it's shev al taset called in the Hebrew. If they're doing it in a passive way, they're not telling you to go and do a sin. They're telling you don't have to say all these words. They're exempting you from saying all the words. And so Tosfos says that's the exemption. And Ezra says, what do you mean? Well, you need such an exemption? The Torah doesn't say specifically the whole benching. The Torah says you got to say something about the zon that Hashem gives sustenance. You got to speak about Eretz Yisrael, speak about Yerushalayim. That's good enough. That's it. The rabbis are the ones who made the brachas, so they could tell you, this is the exact, this is the wording. That's the wording. They tell you it's okay. So Ezra has a very good point that it would seem Tosfos was taking things to a little extreme over here. And why can't Tosfos just be satisfied with the fact that the rabbis are not uprooting anything in the Torah? Why is Tosfos saying, you're allowed to uproot something? They're not uprooting something from the Torah. They're just summarizing, they're changing the wording around. So that's a very good question, Ezra. Let me just answer you that the way Tosfos is understanding it is that from the Torah, the wording, you're right. You're right correct about the wording. But the way Tosfos sees it is that there is a number of brachas that need to be here. And that's the way Tosfos understands the benching. There has to be three brachas. And as we mentioned yesterday, that they learn it from the pasuk, that the zu berchas hazon, zu berchas zu Yerushalayim, zu Eretz Yisrael, zu haaretz, berchas haaretz, that it says different words in the pasuk that tell you these three different points. And so Tosfos understands that these 3 points, the wording, you're right, is rabbinic. But these 3 points need to have 3 separate brachas. And what are the rabbis doing? No, you don't need 3. You can have 2 brachas. That is considered oiker davar min haTorah. They are uprooting the law that you need 3 brachas, and they're saying, no, we'll let you go with 2. And that is how Tosfos is understanding it. But at the same time, what you're saying is mentioned in other commentaries, and therefore they argue. There is those that argue on Tosfos. There are commentaries that argue on Tosfos. Yes, Robert.
Again, I mean, part of what I want to ask as part of the consideration is the taskmaster or those who are supervising, whether they're slaves or indentured servants, they're Jews. And so there is an obligation to allow Jews to pray, to be part of the prayer process, irrespective of their status. And that, to me, is a very legitimate consideration.
Now, that's a very good point. And what you're saying is brought by one of the commentaries. He asks it a little differently. He asks like this. He says, one of the commentaries asks, would the rabbis uproot something from the Torah just because of a financial loss? Does that make sense that the rabbis would uproot from the Torah? It's a financial loss. It seems very surprising that the rabbi, if there was a major reason, it's causing some type of big sins that are happening, causing men and women, boys and girls to hang out together or something, some other sins that are, it's leading to, fine, the rabbis will uproot something from the Torah. There's a major reason, there's a necessity. This is causing people to get hurt. It's causing danger to life and so on. Here we're dealing with a financial loss to the boss who, we don't know how wealthy he is or how poor he is, but it's causing a financial loss. The rabbi is going to uproot something in the Torah because of a financial loss. So one of the rabbis, so that is a question that one of the rabbis asked on this Tosfos, that it does seem surprising that that Tosfos would be mentioning this and explaining it this way.
Rabbi, can I make a comment?
Now, the other thing that I will say is that your point is a very valid point, Robert, that they should give consideration for them to pray. But I will also say that there needs to be some type of a limit, because you will have people who are going to be davening half the day, and they won't get any work done. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm just saying that there does have to be a limit. The rabbis at that time felt that would be the limit. Now it's hard for us to relate to, because we waste so much time nowadays on who knows what, looking up the news and listening to watching TV, and who knows what people are doing, with all their wasted time checking their emails 1,000 times a day and whatnot, and seeing what the latest joke is and what the latest. But it's hard for us to relate to, maybe also that the necessity of those days, that maybe they did take their time a little more seriously, and that was what the rabbis felt was needed for proper work to be done and proper living the society to live normally. So just an additional point. Yes, right. Susan.
I find the word uprooting bothersome. I would rather say the rabbis abridged the prayers to fit the times, maybe.
Right. But the thing is that in authentic Judaism, the rabbis have the same problem of them abridging is the same problem of uprooting. In other words, there are some groups in Judaism that might like the word abridge, because the rabbis can just abridge things. They can't, they're not going to uproot, but they'll abridge. It's the same thing. Abridge, uproot. If the rabbis can't do it, they can't do it. They can't abridge, they can't uproot. It's all wrong. The only thing is there are exceptions to the rule that they have a right to uproot, and that would be in this case, and that's the term in the Hebrew is Iyar, which is the term used when you uproot something that you planted.
Plant,
so
right.
That's the literal translation of the word to be Iyar. So I'm just going to follow with it. And the reason why you like the word abridge is because in your mind, it's easier to say the rabbi abridged than uprooted. But in truth, it doesn't work that way. It's the same thing. If you can If you can add to the Torah, then it's like subtracting to the Torah. If you abridge something, it's like uprooting it. You know, it's in authentic Judaism.
But
It's gonna be
But
the same
what
thing.
Robert said, because if you're a worker, you don't want to be, you want to do the right thing in both ways, working for somebody and also being a good Jew. I mean,
Right. That's correct. That's correct. There has to be some type of a line to draw where how much you are expected to daven and
I
how
guess the
much
word
work
is
you're expected to do.
I guess the word is accommodation. That's a nice, gentle word to use, okay?
yes, right.
So that's the story over here. So the bottom line is that there is room to learn, and there are commentaries, the Ramban, and it's brought in the Beis Yosef and Shulchan Aruch. They bring down opinions, the Rosh. They bring down opinions that argue on Tosfos and say that the biblical law doesn't say how many brachas need to be there, and because of that, it's not a problem for the rabbis to allow the worker to switch around the actual number of brachas, because they're the ones who established what the brachas are, and this is not uprooting a Torah law. This is a rabbinic thing. This is a rabbinic how many brachas. Biblically, you have to speak about in the brachas. You do need to speak about these 3 points, but that doesn't mean they need to have separate brachas of their own for each point. In other words, that each point that needs to be mentioned doesn't necessarily need its own brachas. This is Ezra's point, and that is a valid point. But Tosfos argues with that. Tosfos says no, it needs to have this amount of brachas. And what's interesting is this Tosfos on page 16, he continues with his point on page 46, because on page 46 he argues with Rashi. How could you say that if you don't have a zimun, you only need 2 brachas? What do you mean? How could you only need 2 brachas? Biblically, you need 3 brachas. You're going to tell me now without a zimun you can get away with 2 brachas? We have a verse that says you need 3 brachas. So Tosfos on page 46, he continues with his logic of page 16, and he argues with Rashi. How could you learn such a pshat? However, we can answer Rashi by saying, like Ezra said, and that is that Rashi holds that the amount of brachas are not a necessity of the benching, but you need to mention those 3 things. But if you think about it, the second bracha of benching includes mazoi. It includes sustenance in it. Al haaretz v'al hamazoi. And if you think about that, that bracha could exempt you from the first bracha. So Rashi's pshat could be answered based on his view, which argues on a Tosfos earlier, which would be that you don't need to have 3 specific brachas, and that's how Rashi could say that if you don't have a zimun, you could actually start with Nagda L'cha. Of course, no one does that, and that's not the halacha, but that would be the understanding of how Rashi could learn the Gemara that way. And it could be Rashi paskins like the other view, like Rav Nachman, but however you're going to say that, however you want to understand how Rashi could explain this Gemara, and then the fact is no one does that. No one. It could be because of the other view. Maybe Rashi holds that we paskin like the other opinion, but not getting into what the final verdict is and what we're supposed to do. But the way Rashi explains the Gemara, now we have a little understanding. And thanks to Ezra this point that maybe Rashi holds that you don't need to have 3 specific brachas as long as you mention those 3 points in the other brachas, and that is how Rashi maybe learns the Gemara. Yes, let's see, we've got some questions, and I don't know who's first here. Let's Simone.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of say something about both what Ezra said and what Robert said. And that is, it seems to me that this is one of the strengths of Jewish law, that there's a certain balance there between. So let's start with Robert's point. The employer's needs and rights and the employees' needs and rights. So it isn't a blanket, there's only one right. We're trying to balance both the rights and responsibilities of the employer and of the employee. In my mind, it's a lot like when you tell the judge is told you're not supposed to give preference to somebody who's poor. You're supposed to treat the poor and the rich both in the same vein. So you kind of are, it's a kind of an area where there's a room for flexibility to balance those things out. That's, it seems to me, one of the things that Torah law does, it has that, I don't know, to call it flexibility is that the word, but that it's not black and white. It's that we're understanding that there's rights and responsibilities on both sides, and that there's a way to take those things into account for everybody.
Not sure if I agree, but okay, we'll let that fly. Next, what's your next point? That was it? Oh, okay, yeah. I'm not really sure how to take that. So it's a little hard. I guess it deserves to be, you know what I mean? I don't know where you're taking that, to where it applies, what you're saying. It's, flexibility. I don't like the word flexibility. It's you know what I mean? It's just not a comfortable word to use when you talk about Jewish law, flexibility. I don't know. It just doesn't sit. I don't know. It's hard for me to enjoy such a statement. I don't know I don't really know what it means. So I can't really talk about it. Okay. Was there any other question?
Rabbi, that's what you're talking about, is that the rabbis have the flexibility to go back and uproot something from the Torah and change it.
I don't like the word flexibility. It's the rabbis are, Hashem wants the rabbis to run the show. It's not like flexibility. I don't know. It just doesn't sit right. Okay, but anyway, it sounds like you might have some points there. I just don't know. You know what I mean? How to make it concrete and make those points clear.
Can I give you another example?
Disagreeing.
Can I give you another example? Okay.
Give one more example, even though my time is up. What?
I want to give you one more example, which I think
make it fast because my time is up. I want to get to Moshe. Make it fast. Tell me that example real fast.
The other controversial. The other example would be abortion. So according to the Catholic Church, it's black and white.
Don't mention Catholic Church over here. Just tell us Judaism.
It isn't black and white.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't like that. I don't know. That also doesn't sit well. Okay. Yes, Moshe.
From the position of gematria, 3 is significant. So is that because it is Doraisa, because of 3, or is it because of the order of the Berachot that make it more significant? And it's been uprooted that 2 are required, can be acceptable. But which of those Berachot are the ones that the worker is allowed to say? Which of those Berachot? That's what I'm trying. Is it because
interesting? Moshe wants to tell us that maybe according to Tosfos, there's a specific number. It has to be 3. According to the other views, there's no specific number. So here you see like a biblical obligation of 3. That's very interesting. And then if you do Zimun, it's 4. So it seems like 3 and 4. Actually, Zimun is an argument among the commentaries if it's biblical or rabbinic. But if you want to learn that it's biblical, then you would have 3 and 4 as being biblical options for potential, not options, but biblical situations for benching is either 3 and 4. Very interesting, Moshe. Okay, thank you. So I just want to conclude then with this idea that we touched upon, and that is that if you follow Tosfos's logic on page 16 and you bring it here, you end up with a major problem, because Tosfos's logic is that you need to have 3 brachos for the only thing is the workers, the rabbis exempted them. The rabbis uprooted a law from the Torah for the workers. But then you learn our Gemara, and our Gemara says, do you know why Hatoy V'Ametiv must be rabbinic? It must be rabbinic because the rabbis uprooted the bracha Hatoy V'Ametiv. Really? It has to be rabbinic if they uprooted it? Didn't we just have that Gemara before where they uprooted the other 2 brachas, and Tosfos tells us it's because it's biblical. And they have the right to uproot a biblical law. So how could our Gemara prove that Hatoy V'Ametiv is rabbinic because they uprooted it? It must be rabbinic. What do you mean? The rabbis have the right to uproot a rabbinic law.
A biblical law.
A biblical law. So that is the question that the Gilyan Hashas, the Kiva Eger is asking over here on this Gemara, and that we touched upon, but I didn't spell it out clearly how it specifically is a question on Taisvis, because otherwise you could learn the Gemara. The question could be asked in general on the Gemara, and that is that we know the statement that the rabbis do have the right to uproot the law in the Torah. So you could ask, well, what does our Gemara mean? But on that, you could say that, number one, you could say, well, for a financial reason, that would not be a reason to uproot a law in the Torah. And therefore, you could say, based on that other commentary that mentions it doesn't make sense that they would uproot a law for financial reasons. So then you can learn our Gemara. If they uprooted the law, the bracha v'atoy v'ametiv, it must be rabbinic, because if it was biblical, they wouldn't uproot it for financial reasons. So that is how you could. But now you have places where he tells us they did uproot the Torah for financial reasons, because they said you don't do the 3 brachas, you do 2. So according to that, then you have a problem with our Gemara. So now, or you could maybe answer that it's surprising that the other brachas they summarized. Hatoy v'ametiv, they're uprooting. So why would they uproot this completely and keep the others? So maybe you could come up with an answer. The Gilyan Hashas, sometimes he says tzarachi and gadol, and sometimes he says tzarachi. Tzarachi means deserves more research. Tzarachi and gadol means it needs a lot of research to come up. So some say that if he just says tzarachi, you could maybe come up with a little answer. Tzarachi and gadol, don't even try to answer it. So maybe you could say that it's surprised that the Gemara is saying it must be rabbinic, because if it was biblical, the payalim are the rabbis are gonna uproot the payalim completely from this bracha. It seems surprising. They should have summarized it like they did with the other brachas. So maybe you could come up, maybe you could say it that way. But anyway, it does seem easier to learn Rashi's shot here, that they didn't uproot any of the biblical law for the payalim for financial reasons. In the other case was a rabbinic thing that they changed, and therefore in our Gemara, the Gemara is saying it must be Hatoy v'ametiv was also rabbinic, because it was biblical. They would not uproot it for financial reasons or for other, for such purposes. Okay, anyway, that I guess we'll have to stop here.